A father's liaisons. A routine morning. The sun had barely risen over the quiet suburban streets of Arlington when Officer Malcolm Reed pulled his patrol uniform over his shoulders, buttoning it up with the efficiency of a man who had done this routine for years. His badge, polished and gleaming, sat clipped to his belt, a symbol of the authority he carried. As he reached for his steaming cup of coffee, the smell of freshly brewed beans filled the kitchen. His wife, Martha, moved around the small yet cozy space with practiced ease, her curly brown hair pinned up in a loose bun. At the dining table sat their 10-year-old son, Jason Reed, a thin boy with deep brown skin and dark curls that always seemed to fall over his eyes. But today, something was different. He wasn't eating. Instead, he absently pushed his scrambled eggs around his plate, his fork making soft clinking noises against the porcelain. "Jason, sweetheart," Martha said, pausing as she set a glass of orange juice beside him. "You've hardly touched your food." "I'm not hungry," Jason mumbled, his eyes locked onto his plate. Malcolm, who had been watching quietly, took a sip of his coffee before setting it down. His police instincts, honed from years of training, could sense when something was off. And something was definitely off. "Jason," Malcolm said, lowering his voice slightly. "Talk to us. What's wrong?" Jason hesitated, his small fingers tightening around the fork. His shoulders slumped forward, making him look even smaller than he already was. "I don't want to go to school," he whispered, barely audible. The room went silent for a moment. Martha crouched beside him, her soft brown eyes full of concern. "Why, honey? Are you feeling sick?" Jason shook his head. Malcolm exchanged a glance with his wife. He had his suspicions already. This wasn't the first time Jason had come up with an excuse to stay home. "Jason," Malcolm said, his voice firmer now, "is someone bothering you at school?" Jason hesitated, then gave a slow, reluctant nod. Elam and Edric. A familiar weight settled in Malcolm's chest. Those two boys had been on Jason's case for months now. Their fathers were well connected in town, sitting on school boards and community councils. They were the type of families who could bend rules in their favor, ensuring their kids faced little to no consequences for their actions. Martha inhaled sharply. "Are they still picking on you?" "Jason, why didn't you tell us?" Jason didn't answer right away. He simply lifted his feet slightly under the table, pulling back his socks to reveal his bruised, discolored toenails. Some of them were cracked, as though they had been forcefully jammed into something hard. Martha let out a horrified gasp. "Oh my God, Jason. What happened?" "They made me run barefoot on the track," Jason admitted, his voice small. "They said kids like me didn't need shoes because I'm black." A tense silence filled the kitchen. Malcolm felt his hands clench into fists. He was no stranger to racism, to cruelty disguised as childhood teasing. But this was beyond cruel. It was calculated. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" Jason just shrugged, his gaze falling again. Malcolm sighed, kneeling beside him. "Listen to me, son. Bullies only keep bullying if you let them. You have to stand up for yourself." Jason's lips trembled slightly. "But I tried, Dad. It didn't work." Martha's brows furrowed. "You mean?" "They laughed," Jason muttered. "When I told the teacher, they just laughed. Said I was lying, that I was being sensitive." Martha covered her mouth with her hands, shaking her head in disbelief. Malcolm's face darkened. This was exactly why he had taught Jason self-defense, so he could protect himself when the world refused to. "You remember the moves I taught you?" Malcolm asked. Jason hesitated. "Yeah." "Then use them," Malcolm urged. "Next time they push you, push back harder. Show them you won't be an easy target." Martha's head snapped toward him. "Malcolm." He ignored her, focused solely on his son. "You have to prove to them that you're not weak." "But Dad, what if I get in trouble?" "Then I'll deal with it," Malcolm promised. "But I don't ever want to hear that you let someone walk all over you again." Jason swallowed hard, nodding slightly, but Malcolm could see the doubt in his eyes. Martha, however, was not convinced. She stood, arms crossed. Malcolm, he's 10 years old. That's exactly why he needs to learn now. Malcolm shot back. The world isn't going to be kind to him, Martha. I wish it were, but it's not. He has to learn to stand his ground before he gets older, and it gets worse. Jason's small voice broke through the tension. Can I have a taser or pepper spray? Martha let out an exasperated sigh, but Malcolm almost smiled at that. Jason was thinking tactically. No, Malcolm said, shaking his head. That could get you in real trouble at school. You don't need weapons, son. You are the weapon. Strength. Confidence. That's all you need. Jason didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway. Martha sighed, rubbing her temples. Malcolm, I really don't think violence is the answer here. Maybe we should go to the school, demand they do something about this. Malcolm scoffed. Oh yeah? And what'll happen? They'll give the boys a slap on the wrist. Maybe make them write an apology letter. No, Jason has to fight his own battles. That's the only way this ends. Jason looked between them, clearly torn. Martha finally relented, but not without a warning. Fine, but if this backfires, Malcolm, if something happens, it won't, Malcolm assured her. He was so sure, so certain that he was doing the right thing. But within hours, that certainty would shatter. A fateful drop-off. Minutes later, Malcolm and Jason were in the car, the tension still thick between them. Jason sat in the passenger seat, his fingers fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. As they approached the school, Malcolm slowed the car, watching as Jason hesitated before unbuckling his seatbelt. Remember what I said? Malcolm reminded him. Jason nodded, his small fingers tightening into fists. Malcolm watched him walk towards the school doors, waiting until Jason disappeared inside before pulling away. As he drove off, he reassured himself that he had done the right thing. That Jason would be stronger because of this. He had no idea that this was the last time he would see his son standing on his own 2 feet. Because within the next few hours, everything would go horribly, unimaginably wrong. And by the time Malcolm realized his mistake, it would be too late. The TRFIC stop, that changed EVEY. Officer Malcolm Reed had been on patrol for nearly 2 hours, his mind still preoccupied with thoughts of Jason. Even as he checked meters and issued the occasional parking ticket, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his chest. Had he been too harsh? He had always believed in teaching his son to be strong, to stand up for himself, but something about Jason's reluctance this morning haunted him. The roads were quiet that morning, with only a few cars rolling through the sleepy town. The radio on his dashboard crackled occasionally with minor reports. Nothing out of the ordinary. Malcolm took another sip of his now lukewarm coffee and sighed. Maybe he'd take a break soon, call Martha, and check in on Jason's day at school. Maybe she was right. Maybe he should have gone straight to the principal instead of pushing Jason to fight back. Just as he was about to turn down the next block, a white Dodge Grand Caravan sped past him, cutting dangerously close to another vehicle. Malcolm's police instincts kicked in immediately. The van had a hospital symbol on its side, but there were no sirens or emergency lights. Something wasn't right. He flicked on his lights and accelerated, catching up quickly. The van hesitated before pulling over to the side of the road. Malcolm stepped out of his cruiser, his hand naturally resting on his holster. Years on the force had taught him that routine stops could turn dangerous in an instant. Approaching the driver's side, he knocked on the window. The glass rolled down, revealing a woman in blue scrubs gripping the wheel tightly. Her face was flushed, her eyes wild with panic. "License and registration," Malcolm said, his voice firm but professional. The woman fumbled for her purse, her hands shaking as she pulled out her documents. He glanced at the ID. Nancy Mulligan, a registered nurse at St. Louis Children's Hospital. "I know I was speeding, officer," she blurted out, her voice strained. "But there's a child in the passenger seat. He's unconscious. I'm trying to get him to the hospital as fast as I can." Malcolm's gaze shifted to the passenger seat. The figure was wrapped in an emergency blanket, an oxygen mask covering most of the small face. His chest tightened. "Why aren't you in an ambulance?" he asked, glancing back at the nurse. "All our ambulances are out." "This was the fastest way," she answered quickly, her grip tightening on the wheel. "I had to make a judgment call." Malcolm nodded, understanding the urgency, but before he could step back, the blanket shifted slightly. A glimpse of dark curly hair peeked through. His breath hitched. Something cold and sickening settled in his stomach. He leaned in closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. His eyes darted to the small hand resting limply on the seat. Small fingers. Fingers he knew. His world tilted. He reached out, his hand trembling as he carefully peeled back the edge of the blanket. And then his breath caught in his throat. It was Jason, his son, his unconscious, pale, barely breathing son. For a moment, everything blurred. The sounds of the street, the distant hum of traffic. It all faded into a dull roar in his ears. His vision tunneled, his entire existence narrowing down to the sight of his boy lying there, unmoving. "No," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "No, no, no." The nurse's eyes widened as she registered his reaction. Do you know him?" Malcolm's hands clenched into fists. "That's my son," he choked out, his voice raw with disbelief and horror. "That's my son." Nancy's face paled. "Oh my God," she whispered. I had no idea." Malcolm's training snapped back into place, overriding the storm of emotions threatening to consume him. He yanked his radio from his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reed. I have a medical emergency," he barked, his voice breaking with urgency. 10-year-old boy, unconscious, severe injuries. His voice faltered before he forced himself to say it. "Internal bleeding suspected. We are en route to St. Louis Children's Hospital. Get a trauma team ready." He didn't wait for a response. He pulled open the passenger door, his hand shaking as he pressed his fingers against Jason's neck. The pulse was there, but weak. His skin was cold, far too cold. How did this happen?" Malcolm demanded, turning back to Nancy. His mind was spinning, desperate for answers. "Where did you find him?" Nancy's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. "The school," she said quietly. "A teacher found him collapsed on the old playground. He was bleeding internally. His vitals were dropping fast. We had no time to wait for an ambulance, so I drove him myself." Malcolm could barely process what she was saying. His son, his boy. He had been at school. He had walked into that building just hours ago. And now he was fighting for his life. Jason stirred slightly, a weak moan escaping his lips. Malcolm's heart clenched. "Daddy." Jason's voice was barely there, fragile and broken. "I'm here, buddy. I'm right here," Malcolm whispered, gripping Jason's hand tightly. "You're gonna be okay, son. You hear me? You're gonna be okay." Nancy put the van into drive. "We have to go. Now." Malcolm didn't hesitate. He ran back to his cruiser, flipping on his sirens before pulling onto the road, leading the way to the hospital. His hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his heart slamming in his chest. His mind raced. How had this happened? How had Jason gone from walking into school to lying unconscious in a hospital-bound vehicle? And why? Why had no one called him sooner? A sickening realization settled over him. Someone had tried to cover this up, and Malcolm was going to find out who. No matter what it took. A father's worst nightmare. The drive to St. Louis Children's Hospital was a blur of flashing lights, blaring sirens, and sheer, unfiltered panic. Malcolm gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, weaving in and out of traffic with precision honed from years of law enforcement training. But this wasn't just another emergency call. This wasn't some stranger's child. This was his son. His 10-year-old boy, barely breathing, fighting for his life in the back of a speeding hospital van. Every second felt like an eternity. His mind raced as he replayed the events of the morning. He had dropped Jason off at school just hours ago, had watched him walk toward the entrance, had told himself that Jason needed to fight his own battles. But now, that same boy was on the brink of death. How had this happened? Who had hurt his son? He should have protected him. A fresh wave of guilt crashed over Malcolm as he forced his thoughts back to the present. He couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now. Not when Jason needed him the most. As the hospital came into view, Malcolm pressed the gas pedal down harder, determined to get there as fast as possible. The van skidded to a stop outside the emergency entrance. Before it had even fully halted, Malcolm was out of his cruiser, running toward the back doors. 2 nurses in blue scrubs were already waiting, pulling the stretcher from the van as the doors swung open. Jason's small, fragile body lay still against the sheets, the oxygen mask covering half his face, his skin pale. His tiny fingers twitched, his body barely reacting to the movement. "Get him inside now," Malcolm shouted, following the gurney as they rushed through the sliding glass doors. Inside the emergency room, chaos erupted. Doctors and nurses swarmed the stretcher, shouting instructions to one another. Machines beeped wildly, monitors flashed red, and an IV was immediately inserted into Jason's tiny arm. Malcolm tried to step forward, but a firm hand landed on his chest. "Officer Reed, you need to wait outside," said a nurse, her voice firm but kind. "That's my son in there." Malcolm snapped, his breath coming fast and shallow. "I know, sir, but you have to let us do our jobs." He wanted to argue. He wanted to fight them, to demand answers, but his feet felt like they were made of cement. His hands shook as he stared at Jason, motionless under the bright hospital lights. Then, just before the doors swung shut, Jason's fingers moved. His son was still fighting. Malcolm stumbled backward, the weight of everything crashing down on him all at once. His heart pounded, his vision blurred, and he had to brace himself against the wall just to stay upright. A soft hand touched his arm. "Malcolm." Martha's voice broke through his haze. He turned to find his wife standing there, her face stricken with fear, her eyes puffy from crying. She had been called the moment Jason was admitted. She had rushed here just as quickly, her face a mirror of his own panic and despair. They just took him in," Malcolm managed, his voice hoarse. "They said he's got internal bleeding. He might." His throat closed before he could finish the sentence. Martha sucked in a sharp breath, her hands covering her mouth. "Oh God." Malcolm reached for her, pulling her close. They clung to each other, both parents shattered, their worlds spiraling out of control. A doctor approached them, clipboard in hand, face grave. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed." Martha nodded quickly. Yes, please, tell us, what's happening to our son?" The doctor exhaled heavily before speaking. "Jason has suffered significant internal trauma. His liver has been damaged, and he's experiencing major blood loss. We've stabilized him for now, but he needs a transfusion immediately." Malcolm's pulse spiked. "Then take my blood. Take whatever he needs." The doctor shook his head. "I'm sorry, but Jason's blood type is B. It's rare. We need to find a compatible donor." Martha's knees buckled slightly, and Malcolm tightened his grip around her. "How long do we have?" Malcolm asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hours," the doctor admitted. "Maybe less." Malcolm's world spun again. His son didn't have time. His hands balled into fists. His training, his discipline, his years as an officer, all of it meant nothing if he couldn't save his own boy. There had to be someone out there with the right blood type. Someone who could help. Martha pulled out her phone, her hands shaking. "I'll call family. Friends. Anyone we know." Malcolm ran his fingers through his hair, frustration boiling under his skin. This was taking too long. Jason needed blood now. He turned on his heel and stormed down the hall toward the front desk. "I need a list of every registered blood donor in this hospital," he demanded, slamming his badge down on the counter. The receptionist blinked, startled. "Officer, my son is dying," he growled. "And if you don't help me find a match, I swear to God." Before he could finish, a voice spoke from behind him. "I'll do it." Malcolm turned sharply. Standing there, still wearing her scrubs from earlier, was Nancy Mulligan, the nurse who had driven Jason to the hospital. "I have B blood," she said, "and I'm a frequent donor. I haven't eaten today, so I can donate immediately." Malcolm stared at her, stunned. You'd do that? For my son?" Nancy gave him a soft, knowing smile. "I lost my little brother when I was Jason's age. He didn't get the help he needed in time. If I can stop another family from feeling that pain, I will." For the first time in hours, hope flickered inside Malcolm. He grabbed Nancy's hand, his voice breaking. "Thank you." She squeezed his hand before looking at the receptionist. "Get the doctors. We don't have time to waste." Within minutes, Nancy was prepped for the transfusion. The doctors moved quickly, hooking her up as Jason was wheeled into another room. Malcolm and Martha watched through the glass as their son, their baby boy, was given the blood he so desperately needed. As the transfusion began, Malcolm reached for Martha's hand. For the first time since this nightmare began, he allowed himself to believe that Jason might just make it. But even as hope returned, another fire burned in Malcolm's chest. Who had done this to his son? He was going to find out. And when he did, there would be hell to pay. A hunt for justice. Malcolm sat outside the hospital room, where his son was still unconscious, his fingers gripping the armrests of the waiting room chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The transfusion had bought Jason time, but they weren't out of the woods yet. His small body had endured severe trauma, and while the doctors had managed to stabilize him, the next 24 hours would determine whether he would recover, or if the damage was too severe. The thought sent a violent shudder through Malcolm's body. Martha sat beside him, silent. She had spent the last hour making quiet calls to family members, updating them, but her face remained frozen in shock. She had barely spoken since they learned about Jason's injuries, and Malcolm knew that beneath the silence, her pain was just as deep as his. The doctors had given them nothing to do but wait. Wait for Jason to wake up. Wait for his body to accept the blood transfusion. Wait to see if there were complications. Malcolm was not the type of man who waited. His mind burned with a singular question. Who did this to my son? Someone had hurt Jason. Someone had beaten him so badly that his liver had nearly ruptured, that he had been found unconscious and alone on the school's abandoned playground. And no one, not the school, not the teachers, not the principal, had even bothered to call them. Malcolm could feel the fury rising inside him again, burning through the grief and helplessness like gasoline thrown onto a fire. He was done waiting. He needed answers. Now. He stood abruptly, causing Martha to flinch beside him. "I need to go," he muttered, barely able to keep his voice steady. Martha finally turned to face him, her eyes glassy and hollow. "Where?" Malcolm's jaw clenched. "To the school." Martha sucked in a breath, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Malcolm, no. I have to, Martha." His voice was hard, almost unrecognizable. "Our son is lying in that room because of something that happened at school, and no one thought to call us. No one thought it was serious enough to let us know until it was almost too late." His voice cracked at the last words, but he forced himself to keep going. "I'm going to find out exactly what happened." Martha's face twisted with conflict. He knew she wanted answers too, but she was terrified that he would let his emotions drive him into something dangerous. "I'll be back before he wakes up," Malcolm promised, though he wasn't sure if it was a promise he could keep. Martha exhaled shakily and nodded. "Just be careful." With that, Malcolm turned on his heel and strode out of the hospital, the anger pulsing through his veins like a second heartbeat. Rory tu arning tu de scene of de crime. The drive to Harmony Hills Elementary felt surreal. It had only been that morning that he had dropped Jason off, watching his son walk through those very doors. Now Malcolm was returning, not as a father dropping off his child for a day of learning, but as a man hunting for the truth. He pulled into the parking lot with a screech of tires, stepping out before the engine had fully shut off. His badge flashed in the afternoon sun as he stormed toward the front entrance. The school receptionist barely had time to register his presence before he was demanding to see the principal. "Officer Reed," she stammered, clearly thrown off by the barely contained rage in his voice. "Where is he?" Malcolm snapped. She hesitated. "Principal Howard is in a meeting right now. Maybe if you'd like to schedule a—" Malcolm slammed his hands on the counter. "I am not scheduling a damn appointment. My son is lying in a hospital bed right now because of something that happened on this campus, and I will be speaking to him now." The woman jumped at his outburst, but quickly picked up the phone, dialing the principal's office. "Sir, Officer Reed is here. He insists on speaking with you immediately." A tense silence stretched before she nodded. "Yes, sir." She turned back to Malcolm with wide eyes. "You can go in." Malcolm didn't wait for an invitation. He shoved the office door open so hard that it hit the wall behind it. Principal Howard, a stocky man in his late 50s with thinning gray hair, looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to outright nervousness. "Officer Reed," he began, pushing his glasses up his nose. "I understand you're upset, but—" Malcolm cut him off. "What the hell happened to my son?" Principal Howard blinked. I was just about to call you, I swear." "Just about to call me?" Malcolm barked out a humorless laugh. "Jason has been in the hospital for hours, and you were just about to call me." The principal shifted uncomfortably. "Officer Reed, I understand this is a difficult time. But, no, you don't understand anything." Malcolm growled, stepping closer to the desk. "My son was brutally attacked on your watch, and you did nothing. You let him be found unconscious in a playground that no one even supervises." His voice lowered into something far more dangerous. "What the hell is going on in this school?" The principal swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk. We have rules in place, Officer Reed. If there was bullying involved, we'll investigate." Malcolm slammed his hands down, making the older man jump. "Don't you dare feed me that bullshit," Malcolm hissed. "My son told me this morning that Elam and Edric were tormenting him. Did you know that?" The principal hesitated. Malcolm's fury grew. "Did you?" "No." Finally, the man sighed. "Officer Reed, Jason did report some incidents with those boys in the past, but there was never any proof." Malcolm finished for him. His nostrils flared. "Because their families are rich. Because their fathers donate to this school." The principal didn't answer. He didn't have to. Malcolm's blood boiled. "Where are they?" he demanded. "Who?" "Elam and Edric." The principal hesitated again, his eyes darting away. Malcolm clenched his jaw. "Don't make me ask again." The principal exhaled through his nose. "Their parents picked them up early. Said they weren't feeling well." Malcolm scoffed. Convenient. His pulse pounded in his ears. Those boys had run the moment they realized what they had done. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Malcolm straightened. His voice was like steel when he spoke. "You listen to me very carefully, Principal Howard. I am pressing full charges against those boys. They are not going to get away with this." His hands curled into fists. "And if I find out that you or anyone in this school has tried to cover up what happened, I will make sure you never work in education again." The principal swallowed. Malcolm didn't wait for a response. He turned and stormed out of the office. This wasn't just about Jason anymore. This was about justice, and he was going to make damn sure it was served. Confrontation and Kigon. CEQENCs. Malcolm stormed out of the principal's office, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. His police instincts screamed at him to stay rational, to collect evidence, to follow protocol. But this wasn't just another case. This was his son. And right now, all he saw was red. His phone buzzed in his pocket. For a second, he considered ignoring it, but something told him to check. Pulling it out, he saw the caller ID. Detective Bradley Johnson, his superior officer and longtime friend. "Bradley," Malcolm said, his voice tight. "Malcolm." Bradley's voice was calm but firm, the way it always was when he knew Malcolm was on the verge of losing control. "I just spoke to the hospital. Jason's stable, but it's still touch and go. The doctors say he won't be fully in the clear for at least another day or two." Malcolm swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the phone. The brief relief that Jason was still fighting was drowned out by the boiling rage inside him. "I'm at the school," Malcolm said. "Principal Howard just told me Elam and Edric were pulled out early by their parents." Bradley sighed on the other end. "Yeah, we just confirmed that. Their families are lawyered up already. They're trying to get ahead of this." Malcolm clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. "You've got to be kidding me." "You know how it is," Bradley said, his voice laced with frustration. "Their fathers are connected. We're going to have to fight for every inch of justice here." Malcolm exhaled sharply, pressing his fingers against his temples. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but hearing it out loud made his blood pressure spike. "Where are they now?" "At home," Bradley said. "I just sent a couple of uniforms over to question them, but you and I both know their parents won't let them talk." Malcolm's fingers curled into fists. These weren't just kids who had made a mistake. They had brutalized Jason, left him for dead, and then had the audacity to hide behind their parents. "Meet me at their house," Malcolm said. Bradley hesitated. "Malcolm, listen. I need to see them," Malcolm growled. "I need to look them in the damn eyes and make them understand that they can't hide from this." A heavy silence filled the line before Bradley finally spoke. "I'll meet you there. But Malcolm, keep it professional." Malcolm didn't answer. He ended the call, shoving his phone into his pocket before heading back to his car. He climbed in, gripping the steering wheel so hard his fingers ached. If these kids thought they could get away with this, they were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. A Wraith CKONANG at DHE State. Elam and Edric lived in the wealthiest neighborhood in town, a place lined with towering iron gates and massive estates that screamed privilege. Their families had money, influence, and connections, but none of that would protect them from the truth. Malcolm pulled up outside a sprawling white mansion, its driveway lined with expensive cars. Bradley's unmarked car was already parked outside, along with 2 patrol units. A few officers stood at the entrance, their expressions unreadable. As Malcolm stepped out of his cruiser, Bradley approached, his sharp eyes scanning Malcolm's face. "You ready for this?" "More than ready," Malcolm said, his voice low. Bradley nodded, leading the way up the long stone pathway. As they reached the front door, it swung open to reveal a tall, sharply dressed man in his late 40s, Gregory Marshall, Edric's father. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed, his expression cold and calculating. "Officers," Gregory said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I assume you're here about the unfortunate incident at the school." Malcolm's hands clenched at the word unfortunate. Bradley spoke first, his tone all business. "We need to speak with your son and Elam Winslow." Gregory's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. Our lawyers have advised against any discussions until we review the details of the incident." Malcolm took a step forward, his entire body coiled with tension. "My son is in a hospital bed because of your kid, and you're talking about legal reviews." Gregory barely blinked. "Officer Reed, I understand this is personal for you." "You don't understand anything." Malcolm cut him off, his voice laced with barely restrained fury. Your son and his friend tried to kill my boy." Gregory's face darkened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "That's a very serious accusation, Officer Reed." Bradley placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder, a silent warning. "We have evidence, Mr. Marshall. CCTV footage shows your son and Elam leading Jason toward the playground. We also have a witness who saw Jason being pushed down the steps." Gregory's expression barely wavered. Boys get into fights. It happens. Malcolm's blood boiled. A fight. Malcolm spat. Jason was left unconscious with internal bleeding. This wasn't a schoolyard scuffle. This was an attack. Gregory sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "We have no intention of letting this escalate into a legal battle. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement." Malcolm stiffened. He knew exactly what that meant. Bradley folded his arms. "You're offering a payoff." Gregory exhaled, his face unreadable. "A settlement. A way to resolve this without ruining young futures." Malcolm's vision went white-hot with rage. "You think money fixes this?" he hissed. "You think writing a check makes this go away?" Gregory's eyes were cold. "I think my son has a future, and I won't let one mistake destroy it." Malcolm took another step forward, his voice dangerously low. "Your son doesn't deserve a future if he tried to take my sons away." Bradley moved between them now, placing a firm hand on Malcolm's chest, subtly pushing him back. "This conversation is over," Bradley said. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "We'll be moving forward with charges. I suggest you get your lawyer ready." Gregory's expression hardened. "Then we'll fight this in court." Malcolm took a deep breath, his entire body vibrating with barely contained fury. "We'll see about that." Without another word, he turned and strode away, his boots heavy against the polished stone. He didn't stop until he was back in his cruiser, gripping the wheel so tightly his fingers ached. The AFTRMAT. Malcolm sat in his car for a long time, staring at the estate. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but hearing Gregory Marshall dismiss Jason's suffering like it was nothing made him realize just how far these people were willing to go to protect themselves. Jason was fighting for his life in a hospital bed. And these people, they were trying to buy their way out of it. Malcolm's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Martha. He took a deep breath before answering. "Malcolm." Her voice was trembling, but there was something else there, something that made his heart stop. "What is it?" he asked immediately. "The hospital just called," she whispered. "Jason's waking up." Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. "I'm coming," he said. He didn't hesitate. He turned the key, the engine roared to life, and he sped away from the estate, leaving behind the world of corruption and privilege. His son was waking up, and soon he would tell them everything. Jason is a case, the truth. The hospital loomed ahead, its towering glass windows reflecting the evening sky. The moment Malcolm parked his cruiser, he didn't waste a second. He bolted from the driver's seat, his pulse pounding as he ran through the hospital doors. He had spent the entire day chasing down answers, but now everything else faded into the background. His son was waking up. He sprinted through the hallways, barely acknowledging the nurses and doctors bustling past him. He knew this place by heart now. The twists and turns of sterile white corridors, the soft beep of heart monitors behind closed doors, the faint smell of antiseptic that clung to the air. As he neared Jason's room, he saw Martha standing just outside, hands clasped together, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. The moment she saw Malcolm, her lips parted with both relief and anxiety. "He's awake," she whispered. Malcolm barely heard her before he pushed through the door. Inside, the room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of machines monitoring Jason's vitals. The small boy lay propped up in bed, looking fragile under the harsh white lights. His dark curls were a tangled mess, his skin pale against the stark hospital sheets. But his eyes, those deep brown eyes, were open. Jason turned his head slowly, and when his gaze landed on his father, his lips parted slightly. "Dad." Malcolm felt the air rush out of his lungs. He had braced himself for this moment all day, had prepared for the worst, had forced himself to focus on getting justice rather than letting himself hope. But seeing Jason awake, hearing his voice, it broke something inside him. He crossed the room in 2 strides, sinking onto the chair beside the bed. His large, calloused hand covered Jason's small one. "I'm here, buddy. I'm right here." Jason's lips trembled slightly, as if he wasn't sure if this was real. His fingers curled weakly around Malcolm's. I didn't think you'd come." Malcolm's heart clenched. "What? Of course I came." Jason's voice was barely above a whisper. I thought you'd be mad at me." Malcolm's brows furrowed. He squeezed his son's hand gently, his voice suddenly raw. "Why would I be mad at you?" Jason blinked, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Because I didn't fight back." A sharp pain shot through Malcolm's chest. He had told Jason to be strong, to stand his ground, to fight. And now, here he was, broken, bruised, lying in a hospital bed, thinking his father would be disappointed. Malcolm swallowed past the lump in his throat. He had failed Jason, not just in protecting him, but in making him believe that he had to face this fight alone. "Oh, Jason," Malcolm said, his voice thick. "I'm not mad. I could never be mad at you." He leaned closer, his large hands engulfing Jason's small ones. "I was wrong to tell you to fight alone. You shouldn't have had to. I should have protected you. I should have listened." Jason's lips trembled. I tried, Dad. I tried to be brave. But they..." He broke off, squeezing his eyes shut as if trying to block out the memory. Martha moved closer, sitting on the opposite side of the bed. "Sweetheart," she said softly, brushing his curls from his forehead. "Can you tell us what happened?" Jason hesitated. For a moment, Malcolm feared he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, Jason nodded. "The truth comes out. I was walking to class," Jason began, his voice weak but steady. "I thought, maybe today would be okay. But then Edric and Ellum came up behind me." He swallowed hard. "They said they wanted to show me something. I didn't want to go, but they said if I didn't, they'd tell everyone I was scared." Malcolm's jaw tightened. These boys had manipulated his son, cornered him into walking straight into a trap. Jason's breathing hitched slightly as he continued. "They took me to the old playground, the one nobody plays on anymore. And then He trailed off, his small hands curling into fists against the sheets. "It's okay, son," Malcolm said gently. "Take your time." Jason blinked rapidly, as if fighting off tears. "They started pushing me, laughing, saying I didn't belong here, saying people like me should know their place." Martha sucked in a sharp breath. Her fingers clutched the bedsheets so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jason's voice wavered. "I tried to leave, but they grabbed my backpack and threw it. Then they said if I wanted it back, I had to do something for them." Malcolm felt like he was going to be sick. "What did they make you do?" Jason's lips pressed together. "They made me climb onto the bench. They said I had to dance for them. Like a monkey." His voice cracked. Malcolm saw red, a violent, blinding rage unlike anything he had ever felt before. "They laughed at me," Jason whispered. "Said if I didn't do it, they'd beat me up." He squeezed his eyes shut. I didn't want to do it, but I didn't want to get hurt either. So I started moving, just a little. But then Edric, he shoved me." Martha's breath hitched. "I lost my balance," Jason said, his voice barely audible now. "I tried to grab something, but there was nothing there. I fell, and I hit something really hard." He blinked, confused. I don't remember anything after that." Malcolm felt his entire body tremble with rage. His son had been humiliated, beaten, and left for dead. And those boys, their families, thought they could just walk away. No, not this time. Martha covered her mouth, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. "Oh, my baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. Malcolm forced himself to take slow, deep breaths. He couldn't lose control. Not now. Jason needed him. "You did nothing wrong, Jason," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "This wasn't your fault. Those boys, they did this, and I promise you, they are going to pay for it." Jason looked uncertain. "But they're rich. They get away with everything." Malcolm met his son's eyes, his own filled with unwavering determination. "Not this time," he vowed. Justice on the horizon. After Jason had fallen back asleep, exhausted from recounting his trauma, Malcolm stepped out into the hallway. He barely had time to process what had happened before his phone buzzed again. "Bradley." He answered immediately. "Tell me you've got something." "We've got enough to press charges," Bradley said. "The witness testimonies, Jason's statement, and the medical reports. It's all damning." There was a pause. But the DA is hesitant. The families are already putting pressure on them to drop the case. Malcolm clenched his jaw. "Then we go public." Bradley exhaled sharply. "You sure about that?" "If the system won't protect my son," Malcolm said, his voice cold, "then I'll make sure the whole damn world knows what happened to him." There was a beat of silence. Then Bradley sighed. "All right, let's bring them down." Malcolm ended the call, his heart pounding. This wasn't over. Jason was going to get justice, no matter what it took.